Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Crawford, the Senior Assistant Director of Regional Engagement and Professional Network Initiatives at William & Mary. I'm excited to welcome you to today's virtual wine tasting with Eric Rydin, class of 2010, owner and managing partner of Grand Triage in New York, New York. Today's event is possible by William & Mary New York City network of alumni, parents, family, and friends. I encourage you all to join their Facebook group to continue conversations and to get info on upcoming events. Before we begin, I would like to highlight a few upcoming virtual engagement opportunities offered by the William & Mary Alumni Association. To learn more about these events and to register for them, please visit wmalumni.com. We will have an online networking hour next Tuesday, and please visit wmalumniagain.com for our remaining events for next week. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we will notify registrants once the recording is available. Questions are encouraged, and Eric will answer as many questions that time will allow. If you roll over the bottom portion of the Zoom window, you will see a chat icon. Please use that feature to submit your questions, making sure you are posting your question to everyone. Also, a reminder, this tasting is best viewed in speaker view, so you will see Eric better versus gallery view, which is more like Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares style. Throughout our tasting, I will monitor the questions and share them with Eric. We are truly delighted to have Eric join us to share his expertise and insight with the William & Mary community this evening. Eric Rydin is a graduate of the class of 2010, majoring in English and film studies, and is now the owner and managing partner of Grand Triage on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Eric began work in the beverage industry in 2011 after a short stint in the education and nonprofit space, jobs which proved instrumental in helping craft engaging classes for both wine and spirits over the years. Eric became a certified sommelier through the Court of Master Sommeliers in 2015 and then opened the Upper East Side boutique, which he named the Grand Triage, or the Great Selection, later that same year. Since its inception, Le Grand Triage has garnered attention as the neighborhood's best mom and pop shop, with particular emphasis on smaller family-owned producers and wines that are organic, biodynamic, or conscientiously made. Eric and his store's approach is all about education. So while his classes in the shop may be on pause for the moment, that hasn't prevented him from shifting them online. I will now turn off my screen and turn it over to Eric. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Elizabeth. If you all maybe grabbed a bottle of Sancerre to play at home, feel free to jump into the wine now, and we'll talk about the pairings and all that history and stuff in just a little bit. Anyway, if you're wondering how someone with an English and film studies degree from William & Mary ended up as a small business owner in New York City, well, I think I'm probably just as confused about that as you are. But I really think the opportunity can best be described as a snowball of yeses. With every new job, with every new position, I simply said yes. My first taste of this industry was actually a high-end catering company that mostly employed models and aspiring actors. I think I was the only person who probably submitted their application with a Facebook profile picture rather than a headshot, but I guess it worked out all the same. I eventually parlayed that into running the catering department for a small boutique hedge fund that went bust eventually, and then I found my way into sales for wine retail. My first job in that world was at this tiny little wine store in Harlem where one person worked at a time. So if you had to use the restroom, you had to like put the actual sign that said, back in 5, right? And so I worked there for a little bit and then made my way to a much larger wine store that had a lot of personality, but a little bit more of that kind of bulk style of wine store. They probably did something like 3 million a year in revenue, something like that. And that's probably where I really, really started to learn to start to appreciate wine. But during this whole time, I was still pursuing writing, since that's what my degrees from William & Mary were kind of best suited for. And I think having immersed myself in the creative arts and the creative field for so long deluded me into thinking that the only way that I could be creative in the real world was by having a job doing something, well, creative, right? Writing, singing, dancing, acting, whatever, kind of the classic creative pursuits. And my next job in wine would actually change all of that forever. I actually got that position because of another William and Mary alumnus, Daniel Orison, who was in the class of 2009. I had responded to a Craigslist ad about a part-time wine instructor in downtown Manhattan. And when I arrived, I actually recognized the bottle of wine that Dan makes with his wife in Portugal. From there, he actually ended up offering me a full-time job managing their retail store just on the spot. Like, do you want this job? Forget about the part-time nonsense. We want you. And so that's kind of where all of this really started. And this store was really, really impressive in its heyday. They did something like 10 million a year in revenue with this laundry list of classes, events, and private clients that included Greg Popovich and Darren Williams. But the back end was super, super disorganized, and they needed a lot more structure to be truly, truly successful. And I began creating much of that standard operating procedure and found that I actually got the same level of satisfaction from creating the infrastructure of their business while working there that I would get from creating a fictional character or a story. And that was really, really surprising. So while I learned a lot about wine and business while I worked there, I think the most important thing I learned, as Ivy League as it sounds, the most important thing I learned was about myself. And I learned that the creative void that I felt was missing in my life could be satisfied with creative pursuits within other industries. And it's why starting the Grand Triage was so appealing to me initially. But I think discovering that creativity exists in so many different ways with so many different definitions was really, really, really important, because as a creative, I think you get the largest amount of fulfillment in seeing what you've created come to life, right? Creating only has this joy when you see it out there, out and about as a real boy, right? Living, breathing, and existing. And I think as an aspiring writer, one of so many in New York City and in the world, the likelihood of seeing your creative pursuits animated in real life, existing in real life, is very, very small. And so I think that I was kind of constantly in this uphill battle where I was, bearing my soul, kind of putting my heart into creating things, again, in traditional creative pursuits, but that never came to fruition. And what I realized is that in the business world, because I was getting the same satisfaction of creating things, but the big difference is that I got to see them in reality. I got to see them made. I got to see them completed, and I got to see objectives met. And I think that I never expected to have that level of satisfaction seeing that creativity come to life and be completed. But that was probably one of the most valuable things that I learned while working with Daniel Orison at this shop called New York Vintners a couple of years back. And anyway, so fast forward from working with him, and I had this opportunity to open the Grand Triage on the Upper East Side in 2015. And I didn't go to business school. I never even took a single business class, so I had no idea what to expect when I started the Grand Triage. But let me tell you a little about something called Murphy's Law. I guess we invoke it all the time as this like joke of sorts that when things don't go as planned, like, oh, must be Murphy's Law. But I actually feel like it should probably be taught in like the expectations of entrepreneurship. Truly, truly, I feel like nothing ever goes right. And I don't know how much of that is really taught in business school, but I think having majored in English and film studies, probably about the same in terms of leading to that point, just because of how many things went wrong, this true comedy of errors. I mean, one of the things that went wrong was just simply depositing the initial funds into our bank account. Like, it seems so simple. Like, you make a business, open a checking account. And even that went horribly, horribly wrong. Somehow our account was flagged for fraud in this certain way that they had forcibly frozen all of our money after we had written something like 20 plus checks to different vendors, including the state of New York and all of these other agencies, state agencies. And we actually eventually we got a letter from our bank apologizing for the error, but that didn't make delaying opening by about a week any better. Of course, it didn't put more dollars into our pocket, but we did get an awesome letter, thanks. And the only solace I got from my dad when I told him, like, oh my gosh, this is so horrible, my dad just tells me, welcome to business. You know, like, this is kind of this is how it is. This Murphy's Law is, you know, something that exists for a real reason. It's not just something we joke about, but I feel like every entrepreneur is like, oh yes, Murphy's Law, you mean the first 3 years that I had my business, right? They might as well be called the exact same thing. And that was just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Within our first 3 years of business, we were sued, we were audited, and then we were investigated by the State Liquor Authority of New York because nearby competitors were actually throwing out false accusations of what we were doing with our business. And so while I didn't go to business school, I'm not sure that they teach you how to handle all of those things. I'm not sure anyone does, to be honest. But figuring out how to tactically respond to each and every one of those things, I think, was instrumental in overcoming them and not being kind of drowned by those huge hurdles that we faced all the time. But really, I think maybe the most important piece to get right when we first started Le Grand Triage was figuring out exactly who was working for us. In startup environments, when the workforce might be pretty small, I think it's really important to get that piece of the equation right. And as bizarre as it sounds, I think actually my experience as an RA at William & Mary really helped me with that. I was a residence assistant in a freshman dorm. Go Yates! I was an RA there for 2 years, and I think what's really interesting is when I think back to my freshman year and I think back to what made it so special, it was the bond with all of the people in that freshman hall. In fact, I'm still really close to those people. We have little Zoom calls every so often. We've actually done little wine tastings as well. And there's something so special and so unique about the bond within a freshman hall at William & Mary. I'm sure every single one of you knows that experience and could agree and talk about it firsthand. And that was something that I had, again, as a freshman. And so becoming an RA for a freshman hall, there's this part of your brain where you think, I want to recreate that, this freshman hall, this amazing freshman hall, and I'm part of that, right? And the reality of it is, as a sophomore and a junior, you're really not that far in age from all the kids who are freshmen. But I think there's a really important distinction between that freshman hall dynamic and the RA. And it sounds bizarre, but I think the role of that RA is to really make sure that every single one of those freshmen have that unifying, amazing connection, that amazing freshman year. And whether you're part of that equation or not is irrelevant, right? It's all about creating that for them, right? And that could be at the expense of your relationship with them. And when I will see on Facebook, you know, some of the kids that were in my freshman hall, and I was their RA, and I still see them chatting with each other on Facebook and posting on each other's walls, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that kind of I succeeded in helping create that relationship amongst all of those freshmen. And we take that same approach with our employees at work, that we want to make sure that they get along, but I don't know, I guess also have this potential for lifelong friendship, right? And that if you could create a bond with your employees the same way that these freshman halls are just indescribably linked and indescribably connected, if you can create that with a work environment, and then again, whether you as that kind of structure above them, if you're part of that or not, or you're just helping fostering that, I think that's so imperative. I think we see a lot in sports as well. a lot of coaches, I think, are referred to in a very similar manner, that their ability to create a connection between their players, that's what's so important. And you might not see the coach go out with them after the game or whatnot, but it's so important that the coach create that environment with their team. And so the exact same way that it is for William and Mary, for our sacred freshman halls, we actually take that exact same approach to our staffing. And so while it took us a little bit of time to figure out exactly who those people are and how to create that environment, I think we've now actually perfected that really, really well. And the selection process that we do with our staff in how it gels and how it completes with that environment is just as rigorous as the selection for the wines that we decide to bring into our store. Yeah, I think that if that's probably one of the things that to us has been the most important and most instrumental in bringing success to our store. And then having worked in the nonprofit and educational space as well, I think has really changed how I present wine to people, because sometimes it seems like a very difficult thing to wrap your head around, and it's very intimidating and people are afraid to kind of learn. But one of my favorite things about wine is that not one person is born knowing about wine, more about wine than any other person, right? Everyone has to learn. Everyone has to start from zero. And so I think having this kind of pretentious stance about wine is outdated, and it's something that we're trying to fix. And I think using actual teaching strategies, appealing to visual learners, oral learners, different types of learners, is something that makes our classes so much more engaging than the average. But anyway, I don't want to bore you guys too much about kind of our initial start into the Grand Triage, but would love to hear from you guys about any questions and whatnot. So I think Elizabeth might facilitate.
Sorry, thanks, Eric. If anybody would like to chat in questions right now regarding the topics that Eric just covered, you're more than welcome to use the Q&A icon down at the bottom. Eric, right now we don't have any questions, but that doesn't mean that we might not receive a few in the next few seconds. If we don't, let's just go ahead and get started with the tasting. I think to your last point, even though some people, everybody's not born with the ability to be a sommelier, you, I think, are definitely an expert here. So we're really excited to learn from you today. So doesn't look like there's any questions, so why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sure. So we're going to jump into the tasting portion of our webinar. And so if you grabbed a bottle of the Sancerre that we mentioned, this is the bottle we were talking about, Carine Laverjat Sancerre. If you just grabbed any bottle of Sancerre, that's fine. But hopefully it's nice and chilled, nice and cold. But if you've got a glass, I want you to just take another sip right now and get that all in your mouth face, your mouth hole, the thing that's here. But take a sip of that. I will do the same. I'll join you all. And I think one of the important things to just focus on with wine, again, so many people get intimidated by wine, but I think one of the most important things to focus is just, do you like the wine, right? No textbook tastes wine for you. No somm tastes wine for you, right? They don't baby bird it, drink it and then kind of, drop it sip by sip into your mouth. You get to taste it. And so your opinion, even though we're programmed to think that we maybe don't know as much or don't have the fancy vocab, it's still you that's drinking it. And so your opinion really does matter. So I just want you to think, do I like this wine? A lot of people think even, what do you mean, do I like this wine? And I want you to think that if you were at a restaurant or a wine bar or maybe a retail shop or something, and you took a sip of this wine, would you order another glass? Would you buy the bottle, right? If you were invested in it enough to grab that bottle, that probably means that you like it. If you're like, it's okay, just so, then you're probably, that's fine. You're okay. It's okay to be so on a wine. And then, of course, if you don't like it, hopefully we're able to recognize if we don't like the wine, we're not enjoying some of the flavors. But maybe just take a quick second and think, do I like this wine? Would I order another glass? Now I want you to take one more sip of this wine, and I want you to focus really, really closely on what's happening in the very back of your mouth, right back here. You're actually going to feel this like pinching, tensing up. So take that sip, and as you're swallowing, you're going to feel this pinch or kind of sensation in the very back of your mouth that's going to pinch right back here. If that's too extreme, you don't feel that pinch, you might find yourself salivating a little bit more after you swallow the wine, right? So if you don't get maybe both of those, you should get one for sure. But so take another sip. I'll give you guys a couple seconds to take a sip, and then really just kind of look for that pinching, tensing up, or that extra salivation in your mouth. The response that you're getting here, this response here, is what we call acidity. Acidity like acid, right? Your mouth is actually responding to the natural acidity in this wine, and it's forcing you to salivate. And if you think back to, grade school and Pavlov and his dogs, and, when Pavlov rings his bell, obviously the dogs are salivating, and it's not because the dogs are like, man, bells are cool. You know what's cool? You know what's in? Bells. No, that's not what the dogs are thinking. The dogs, of course, they associate the bells with food. And our brains respond really similarly in that when we salivate, we are actually also inducing hunger, right? We're associating salivation with hunger. So when we have wines that are high in acid and they force you to involuntarily salivate, right? So that acidity that we just talked about forces your salivary glands back here to involuntarily secrete saliva. And that saliva, what it does is it basically creates your brain to start thinking, where's the food? Where's the food? I want the food. The same way that those dogs, Pavlov's dogs, are associating that bell with food. And so what's really, really neat is that wines that are high in acid are naturally better to pair with food than wines that do not have high levels of acid. So if you ever feel that pinching, tensing up in any glass or any bottle of wine, it's a sign that that wine is actually going to be really, really good with food. So maybe you guys have heard it before. You'll take a sip of a wine, or you'll buy a bottle of wine, and maybe we aren't crazy about it, and someone will say, try it with food. And it feels like such a random, arbitrary kind of excuse of just like, you don't know how to appreciate this wine, right? But the truth is that there are certain chemical components of wine that actually make them better suited for food. So wines that are really high in acid, right, that are going to elicit this response, actually make them better to be served with food. In fact, I used to work with this Italian somm years ago who described to me that in Italy, they view wine as a condiment, right? And at first it was like, wine is a condiment? This sounds super offensive, and I don't really understand, but please explain more about what that means and what you're saying. And so condiments, something like, ketchup or mustard or mayo. And I mean, you would never eat ketchup on its own. You would never eat mustard on its own. You would never eat mayo on its own, right? And so if the Italians view wine as a condiment, they would actually never drink wine on its own. It sounds crazy, but the Italians, the idea of pairing wine with food is so sacrosanct in Italian culture that wine is only ever paired with food. It's only on the table when you're eating. Hardcore Italians, and for those of you that have maybe ever been to Italy, when you're around Italians, they're actually only imbibing, they're only kind of drinking wine during meals, or if there's kind of a small antipasti present, something like that. But they're not going to just kind of Netflix and chill the way that we might here in the US. And so that's a really, really big distinction about just kind of how we even think about wine and how we classify it, and not just classify it, but even create it. So when people say, oh, have you tried that wine with food? It's not just this empty random thing that we're saying that means you can't appreciate it because you aren't enough and you don't know enough, but rather that wine was created from its initial inception. The entire philosophy of making that wine was like ketchup, right? You squirt it on your hot dog or on your hamburger or whatever to make it taste better, right? And so sometimes when we're drinking wine on its own and we're not a huge fan of it, well, it might be the equivalent of just kind of like grabbing ketchup or mustard and just eating spoonfuls, right? And obviously that doesn't sound super pleasurable, but that's the experience of certain wines if they're meant to be paired with food, if you drink them on their own without food. So that being said, I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the history of wine pairings and kind of how this stuff works, and especially in relation to acidity, which we just talked about. So first and foremost, I think the easy, simple way to think about wine pairings is through just a very easy equation that I like to think of as flavor A plus flavor B equals question mark, right? We don't know what's going to happen when we put the two together. And flavor A in this case is going to be wine, right? But it could be anything. It could be beer, it could be whiskey, but of course, right now we're going to focus on wine and our Sancerre in particular. Flavor B, again, could be anything. Maybe you guys went out and grabbed some goat cheese, a nice cheese for today, but again, it could be anything. So flavor A plus flavor B equals question mark, right? So we don't know what's gonna happen when we put the two together. And I think one of the most important things about wine pairing is to really understand your flavor A and your flavor B. So many people want to skip to the end and how's the pairing? What's the best pairing, right? But if we take this equation and we just focus on the end result, right? What is the pairing? How do we actually know that the pairing, the result, is better than the sum of its parts, right? How do we know that this combination, we actually don't like A better on its own? How do we know that we don't like B better on its own, right? So I always think that the result, we should kind of think about that last. We should actually kind of get to know our flavors better. If we don't really know flavor A, how can we truly say that the result of A and B is better than A? If we don't really know the flavors of B, how can we truly say that the result is better than flavor B? And so for our little exercise today, what we're going to do is we're going to taste flavor A, talk a little bit about what it is, why it tastes that way, and then kind of forget about it. And then we're going to taste flavor B. If you guys don't have a goat cheese or boucheron or whatever flavor B you might have, it could be crackers, carrots, hummus, it doesn't matter, but whatever your flavor B is, go out and grab flavor B, and then we'll talk about what flavor B is, why does it taste that way, et cetera, et cetera. And then we put the two together, and then we decide, do we actually like that result? Is that result better? Is A plus B equals something better? Is A plus B equals something totally neutral, like I had wine, I had cheese, now I still have wine, I still have cheese? Or of course, what we don't want to happen, but sometimes does, is A plus B equals something negative, something that actually detracts, and we actually really shouldn't combine these two things together, right? But I think it's imperative to understand our flavors A and B first. So go ahead and take another sip of your Sancerre if you guys are following along at home. Best drinking game ever, right? You just drink when I say do it. But if you guys have that Sancerre, take another sip. And again, you're going to notice that that acidity pinching you back here. But if you take one more bigger sip here, I want you to actually swish around the wine in your mouth as though it were mouthwash. I mean, do like full, 30, 45 seconds over your tongue, under your tongue, on the sides of your cheeks, in your gums, right? Imagine like you were actually trying to cure gingivitis with wine, which, by the way, when that becomes a thing, you heard it here first, patent pending, Elizabeth, right? Make sure that's recorded, boom. Anyway, so if you're swishing that around in your mouth nice and vigorously, what happens is you're actually going to pick up this like tingling, buzzing sensation in your mouth as though it were mouthwash, right? And what's really, really bizarre about that is that tingling sensation is actually coming from the vines where these grapes are grown. So Sancerre, if we're not familiar, Sancerre is a region in France, right? So Sancerre is not the name of the grape. Sancerre is the name of the place in France. And the way that the French do it is they're so focused on what this word we call terroir. They're so focused on the physical place where they grow their wines that they focus everything about that physical piece of land. And so the physical place where Sancerre is, it's in this larger region called the Loire Valley, which is, I guess Sancerre is not too far southwest of Paris. But in this area, once upon a time, it was the ocean floor. You could not get lower in the entire world, right? Any deeper than the Loire River Valley in France, right? This is eons ago, right? But back in those days, essentially you had millennia after millennia of crustaceous life that after they died actually kept kind of sinking to the bottom, and all these different layers eventually created limestone. So when the water subsided and we have what is now modern day France and the Loire Valley, we have this incredibly rich, dense limestone that is just littered throughout the Loire Valley. And so these vines for grapes, when they go deep into the ground, they're actually pulling all of these nutrients from the limestone. So that tingling, buzzing sensation that you're actually getting in your mouth is actually all the nutrients from those limestones. So when you think about the nutrients for a grape, when we're growing these grapes, they're actually coming from very rich, high nutrient environments and soils like limestone. If you were to grow the same grape in sand, for instance, which is not high in nutrients, it would come out very different. It would, the kind of somm or industry vocab that we would use is flabby. Oftentimes wines that are grown in sand are described as flabby, but they're not as high, tight, and tension, right? The acidity that we have here, a lot of what we're focused on is just it related to the actual nutrients of the soil. And I think maybe one of the best ways to think about it is sand. If you're out on a beach during the full brunt of a summer's day out on the beach and you have your feet in the sand gets quite hot, right? Meanwhile, at night, that same sand is going to be really cold because sand is going to respond to the natural temperatures very easily, very quickly. Limestone, meanwhile, has this uncanny ability to actually regulate temperature very well. So despite whether sun is beating down on this vineyard during the day and it gets really cold at night, unlike sand, limestone is not easily confused. Limestone is like, we know what the temperature is and we're not fooled by, this shift in temperature between day and night. And so limestone is much more consistent for these vines that are rooted in them to let them know essentially what time of year it is. Because if you have vines that are plugged into sand and every single day, those vines are kind of tricked or fooled into thinking, oh, it's warmer, now it's colder, now it's warmer, now it's colder, now it's warmer, now it's colder, right? Those vines are not going to produce as healthy fruit as the equivalent on our other end for limestone, which is of course consistent, right? And so those vines that are planted in limestone, they know what time of year, they know what season of the year, and they're able to produce very consistent, very healthy fruit, much better than, let's say, their sandy counterparts. So first and foremost, that's kind of what we're talking about for flavor A. So Sancerre, again, the name of the physical place. The grape that we use to make Sancerre wines is a grape called Sauvignon Blanc. We've probably heard that before. Sauvignon Blanc is most famous in Sancerre, but also, let's say Marlborough in New Zealand is where we're going to find a lot of Sauvignon Blanc. There's only 2 grapes allowed to be grown in Sancerre. One of those grapes is red, one of those grapes is white. And white Sauvignon Blanc, if you guys have had it before. Then the other one is Pinot Noir. So that means if there's one white and one red, Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir, that means every single time you see white Sancerre, it has to be 100% Sauvignon Blanc. If you ever see red Sancerre, yes, such a thing exists, it has to be Pinot Noir. And if you ever see pink Sancerre, which sounds crazy, but yes, also such a thing exists, pink Sancerre is actually 100% Pinot Noir, right? So despite the fact that it's pink, pink Sancerre is actually made from Pinot Noir, but it's essentially, it's exposed to its grape skin for a very, very short period of time. So our winemaking grapes, when we actually crush them, we have clear juice, right? The pulp inside is actually totally clear. It's totally translucent. It's just like a grape you might buy at a grocery store. They're actually different species of grapes, the ones you buy at a grocery store, but they're the same in the respect that if you bite into a Thompson seedless or a Concord grape and you look inside and you see the inside is translucent, that's the same as the species of grape that we use to make wine. And so when we crush a white grape or a red grape, we actually get clear juice, totally clear juice. And the only way that we can make a red wine red is exposing the clear juice to the red grape skin that we crushed. If we actually remove the red grape skin from that equation immediately, and we just have that juice, then we'll actually have a white wine. So you can actually make white wine from red grapes. It sounds wild, but you can't do the opposite. You can't make red wine from white grapes. And so for a Rosé Sancerre, it's 100% Pinot Noir, but we're actually just doing a very, very small amount of skin contact to give it a pink color instead of the full-blown red color. So that red Sancerre, which is 100% Pinot Noir, is the full skin contact. Meanwhile, the Rosé is less skin contact. So that's a little bit more about our flavor A. Another two quick things I want to mention about this bottle is just how large the lettering Sancerre is even on this bottle. I mean, it's massive, it's huge. It's even larger than the people who make it, right? Corinne Laverjat, by the way, an awesome, awesome winemaker. She does everything organically. We're huge, huge fans of everything she does. But she's putting emphasis more on the place, Sancerre, than who she even is, because it's more likely you've heard of Sancerre than you have heard of Corinne Laverjat. And this really goes back to this French idea of place or terroir, that everything is so focused on the place that even the way that they label their wines is really based around location, because you're more likely to have heard of Sancerre and to know about its special soil types than you are to have heard of one of so many people that make wine in this region. And I think it's very different than maybe how we label wines in the US. We label everything in the US. It's all about the winemaker. I'm pretty sure that some people are convinced that Robert Mondavi is a grape because of how much we try to brand wines in the US based around the winemaker, right? So in the US, you'll always see the name of the grape first. Meanwhile, in Europe, but particularly in France, all of the emphasis is about the physical place, the physical region. And really the crux of that idea is that this one place, this one region is more unique, or I shouldn't say more unique, but is unique and special in a way that this other place has its own unique and special properties, right? Think about it as like every single place in France is a unique snowflake. And of course we have to honor and respect that. And the best way to do that is to put the emphasis on the names of those physical places, but also the physical features and the geography of those places. And if we can make the wines taste like those physical places, that's what's special, right? And that's a very French philosophy of making wine. It permeates into the rest of Europe, but there's not one country that embodies that concept of terroir more than France. Flavor A, that's flavor A. So let's jump into flavor B. Hopefully you maybe have some cheese in front of you or something, but if you managed to get some goat cheese, some Boucheron was maybe the kind of recommended one that we were thinking about. But if you have kind of anything in front of you, maybe just jump into your flavor B. But again, hopefully maybe a bit of a creamier, gooier cheese. But I'll just wait a second while you indulge in your cheese. Now have more wine as you do so. So hopefully you all have maybe a cheese in front of you. I'll talk about this as though we have this creamy goat cheese in front of you. And if you've had goat cheese before, whether you don't have it physically in front of you or not, maybe we've had goat cheese. And I think one of the best ways to describe goat cheese that I've heard is just goaty. Everyone's like, I know it when I taste it. It's very goaty, right? But goat cheese, I think, is very crumbly. It's very gooey. It's very sticky. Sometimes I feel like it physically gets stuck in the digits between your teeth. It's a very hedonistic cheese. It's very creamy. But I feel like one of the biggest things about goat cheese is it's almost like a hedonist's dream, right? It's fatty, it's creamy. And I think it's the total opposite if you described it in any vocabulary. If you described goat cheese and you described this Sancerre that we're tasting from Korean Laverja, if you tasted those two things, no matter what vocabulary you used, I feel like the vocabulary would not coincide, right? Like you could use any layman's vocabulary, very technical vocab from a wine perspective, and those two things wouldn't be the same. And it really embodies what we call pair by contrast. There's two philosophies when it comes to pairing wine with food. One is called pair by contrast. One is pair by complement. Pair by contrast, a very classic version of that might be spicy food with a sweet wine, right? Spice and sweet, classic pair by contrast. A very classic pair by complement is sweet plus sweet, right? Your dessert wine, your dessert food. So in this case, we are doing two very different things, right? Our flavor A is very sharp and acidic, very lean, right? Meanwhile, our flavor B is very fat, rich, creamy, round. Again, everything, the total antonym of our flavor A. So we have A and B are contrasting elements to each other. So anyway, this is going to be the kind of fun part where I want you guys to do the math, put them together, put A and B together, and try those to see what happens when we have the resulting flavor. The way I might actually suggest doing this tasting is to actually take a bite of the cheese, put a decent little chunk in your mouth, take 1, 2, 3 bites, but don't actually swallow it yet. And while you still have the cheese in your mouth, that's what I actually want you to pick up your glass of wine and introduce the wine while the cheese is still in your mouth. Make sure the two are actually, interacting with each other in your mouth simultaneously. I feel like all the time I hear people ask, like, how do I pair wine with, this, that, or the other? And I think it's actually important to make sure that those flavors actually have some overlap, because if you're just doing, let's say, one flavor followed by another, there's a potential to kind of miss something. So anyway, if you're kind of combining these two together, what should be happening, it's really cool, is the acidity from your wine is actually decreased. You have less of this reaction. And then meanwhile, that sort of like intense, creamy, sticky, gooey part of your cheese is also decreased. So the extremes of both flavors A and B are actually brought more to moderate levels when you combine them together, right? That high acid wine becomes much more of a modest level. And that creamy, goaty, super hedonistic aspect of our cheese is also brought to much more of a modest level. It doesn't seem as crumbly and sticky, right? But when we actually induce more saliva, which is one of the key pieces of this, when we create more saliva in our mouth and a much more lubricated environment for that sticky cheese, right? That's almost half the equation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that kind of like mini little teaser of wine and cheese pairing. Anyway, I see there's a couple questions, so I'll let Elizabeth moderate the questions.
Thanks so much, Eric. Yeah, we had a few questions come in. So what's involved in running a wine store? And can you give an example of a day in the life of you?
I think a lot of people just think that I drink wine literally all day. I stare at spreadsheets probably just the same amount of time and just as long as most of you guys. A lot of budgeting for what we buy, when we buy it. Wine is also very relationship-based business, so I also spend a lot of my time in meetings as well. There's over 300 different distributors in New York City who bring wine from all over the world to New York. And for us to decide what we carry is actually quite a difficult decision. Most stores will make 2 phone calls and figure it out. We work with over 50 distributors, 50 of these 300. And while that makes our job harder on us, I think it gives us so much more choice than your average shop. But I'd say, the kind of day-to-day is really kind of figuring out a lot of the budgeting stuff. And then after 5 p.m., because we are like customer facing business, after 5 p.m. I can get 0 things done in front of a computer. So that's when I just surrender to having a glass of wine in my hand. And I think that's probably why people have this perception that I just drink all day, is because the vast majority of people I see are post 5 p.m. and they just see me holding a glass of wine and they're like, Eric has the best job. He just drinks all day. And they don't get to think about the things like Eric was sued last year, right? Or, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Great. Another question, do you ever travel to source wines? And if so, what's the best wine trip you've ever been on?
Once upon a time, I got to do a little bit more traveling when I was on someone else's dime, especially as kind of the salespeople that are helping sell wines in different environments. A lot of businesses will send their salespeople out to actually learn more about these places, because as they become experts, they're much more passionate and will sell more. Now that I'm on my own dime, we've actually sent some employees out on these same kind of trips, which is pretty cool. But now that I'm on my own dime, it's a little bit harder to send myself out. I wish I could a little bit more, but my time is a little bit more productively spent being at the store. So unfortunately, I don't get to travel as much as I used to. My favorite trips, oh man, maybe a recent trip out to Tuscany. And I think Tuscany out in central Italy, so it's like Florence, Siena kind of area where Chianti, Brunello are kind of the mainstays. There is a absurd hospitality of that region that is just unparalleled. And I think it's something that makes that area, the wines are phenomenal, don't get me wrong, but you can find phenomenal wines anywhere. But again, I think there's a tendency for people to sometimes have this pretentious view about wine, and it happens all over the world. It happens in California, it happens in France, et cetera, et cetera. It happens everywhere. But in Tuscany, there's just this absurd hospitality that really turns that whole pretentious idea upside down. And they're like, let me cook you dinner. Let me do everything for you. And I mean, they're wiping the sauce off your face for you. It's absurd how nice they are there. So if you ever get an opportunity, or if you've been, you probably know, I suppose.
Sounds delightful. I think that might be my next trip. Have you found that your knowledge of wines makes you more inclined to drink beer or liquor in social settings, the drinking version of not bringing work home?
This is a great question. So I was late to a dinner with my fiance a couple of years ago, and I was coming straight from work and I was late. Should have been there at like 7, let's say. And I probably don't get there till like 7:45. And I don't know, I'm sure I promised I'd be there at 7:15, classic. But I get there at 7:45, I'm like still in work mode. And they went ahead and ordered wine. And so there's a glass of wine waiting for me, and I pick it up and I take a sip of that wine, and I look for the spit cup to spit it into, because my brain is still in work mode. I'm still like, but then I realize I'm in a restaurant and I'm like, oh, this is wine for enjoying. This is wine that you should drink, right? And so there is kind of a weird thing of trying to separate that. I think that when I go out, I love wine, and so I still drink it when I go out for enjoyment all the time. But more often than not, when I opt for something like beer and liquor, I'm an equal opportunity drinker. I like everything but vodka. So, so when I'm out, it's what's appealing to me. But more often than not, I end up opting for the beer or liquor because I know what wine costs. And I know when restaurants are maybe charging a little bit higher of a margin on a certain product. So, and I'm not mad at them for it. I'm just not going to participate in it. So if I recognize that a wine has outrageous margins, or a restaurant has outrageous margins on a wine, at that restaurant, I'm going to have a beer, or I'm going to have a glass of whiskey, or, you know, whatever, or a cocktail, whatever it might be.
Great. Another question, can you recommend the sweetest white and red wine?
For sweet whites, Moscato is a great option. Sweet Rieslings as well. For sweet Rieslings, I would look for things with lower alcohol percentage, since sometimes Rieslings are literally written in different languages, so you don't really know. For sweeter red wines, I guess there aren't as many kind of natively sweet ones. I suppose Braccetto, which is a Italian dessert wine. It's actually from the same area as Moscato. So if you actually find Braccetto, Brachetto, I think that's probably going to be your best bet for a sweet Italian red, which is actually really, really tasty. It's kind of like the red equivalent of Moscato, basically.
How was your William & Mary study abroad experience formative with respect to your career path?
Nice question, Tyler. Tyler was my study abroad roommate in William & Mary. That's a good question. I don't think it formed anything for wine. It really made me appreciate beer in a massive, massive way. I think it started to maybe help me understand a lot of the different flavors, the diversity of flavors in the alcohol world, and appreciate it beyond the scope of just alcohol and like getting lit because you're a college student, right? But I don't know that it played a part into creating a career path necessarily, but I think maybe a slightly earlier understanding and appreciation of just flavors, right? That these things can taste like different things, and that people enjoy them and have leanings towards this or that in the same way that they would for chicken or beef or fish and whatnot.
What are your business plans, maybe an example of expansion or growth for the immediate future?
Jasper. All right. Good question, Jasper. Jasper was actually one of the residents in Yates when I was an RA. We don't have plans to expand, mostly because in New York State, it is illegal to actually own more than one physical, what we call off-premise wine store. So you can't have more than one Grand Triage. It's actually not possible. I could have one in New Jersey or Connecticut, but I cannot actually have more than one in the state of New York. So we don't have plans to expand in that way, but we are working on some fun things like a podcast, or perhaps more kind of video kind of shorts, things like this. But I think something more in a digital space is where we're planning to expand rather than maybe physically. And given the current circumstances, that maybe sounds like a smarter move than the physical. And it's actually been something in the works for a little bit.
Can you share any hints on deciphering French wine labels for those with limited time and budget, given that they're by region and not varietal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think something I would probably talk about forever. So I think the best way to answer that very, very quickly is that like we mentioned, Sancerre, you can only grow 2 grapes in Sancerre. Well, all of France is that way, that every single region, you can only grow certain grapes there. And they have these insane rules and regulations about every single one of these regions. I like to think of them as like condo boards, where like these condo boards have like ridiculous rules that you'll never understand. Like, why can't I have a doormat in the hallway, right? You're like, I don't understand why that's against the rules, but it's the rules and you must follow them, right? Well, every single French wine growing region has these inane laws that must be followed, right? Because they must be. And if you just start to get to know what grapes that you like, I would then just do a quick Googling. And I'm also happy to answer those, but I don't know if we have quite enough time to do that, Joanne. But if you do a quick Googling, let's say you just love Pinot Noir, then you can just, with a quick Googling, you can find out where Pinot Noir grows in France. And then you know that those regions, by their name, those are the places where Pinot Noir grows. And so as a somm, we have to learn all of the regions and all the grapes and all of these crazy inane laws. But as someone who's just going out to a restaurant, you just focus on the places in the world where that grape is grown and it's grown best. And so in France, for Pinot Noir, for instance, Burgundy is the be-all, end-all. There's a little bit grown in Loire, there's a little bit grown in Alsace, a little bit grown in the south of France, but the be-all, end-all is Burgundy, and that's kind of where it is. So if you can just kind of figure out your grape, find the corresponding French region, and then focus on that, I think that's going to be something that's going to be your new go-to and something you can ask for, and you can get to know that region a little bit better and a little bit more confidently, rather than waste time learning about different French regions that have grapes that you already know you don't like, right? And maybe you don't know that that region is associated with the grape that you don't like, but don't even waste time thinking about that. Just find the grapes that you like and find the regions where those are most popular.
Awesome. And our last question is, who is your largest customer?
Who is our largest customer? Oh, I guess like as an individual, we do have data on this. We have a really nice woman who comes in with her I think fiance. I think they're engaged, and they just buy a bottle every day, sometimes two. Sometimes they kind of have this like funny miscommunication. We'll see her come in, and then 15 minutes later, her fiance comes in, and he doesn't know that she's just come in. And so sometimes they end up buying 2 bottles every day. But I think they just enjoy this kind of ritual of going to their little local shops and buying, picking up their groceries every day or their wine every day. It's a little bit more European in lifestyle, where instead of buying in bulk at Costco, right, you kind of do your little daily trips to the grocery store, the wine store, whatever. And so they just pop in once every day and buy things. And because they sometimes get their wires crossed and they buy 2 bottles every day, this sweet little couple is probably actually our greatest customer, because after 365 days, they've bought, a lot of wine every year.
All right, last question here. How do you feel about Ontario wines? Are they good? And Tip says, I live in Ontario, so I won't be offended.
I don't know that I've had any wines from Ontario specifically. Canadian wines are something that I'm still exploring a lot. There's a lot of stuff from the Niagara area, because we grow a lot of wines on the New York side of Niagara. But it's something that I'm not as familiar with the official designated Canadian wines. But I've heard amazing murmurs of Canadian wines from both the east and west coast of Canada. It's truly something that I want to explore more. I think because you live in Canada, it's probably a little bit easier to get a hold of Canadian wines. Canada, as you're probably well aware, has a very different structure of laws of how they actually distribute and manage alcohol, which is very strict. So sometimes it's a little bit harder for us to actually get Canadian wines here. So the reason that I'm less familiar is not because I dislike them, but just because the availability of Canadian wines in the US is pretty slim. So it's actually something that I've been wanting to explore more, but restrictions on what's imported from Canada has actually been maybe the largest detractor from that exploration. So Tip, I'll kind of put a mental note to explore a little bit of wines from Ontario.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. Are there any final remarks that you'd like to make?
Yeah, maybe we were a really fun educational wine shop, and we love to do these little wine tastings. That kind of brief preview you guys got of the Sancerre and the goat cheese, the Boucheron, as a little preview of what we usually do for a wine and cheese pairing class. And so if you guys enjoyed it, we do private Zoom classes just like this. And ironically, I think the purpose of doing a lot of things in a digital space is the potential to be able to scale them. And what we've really seen is that because we're doing all of our Zoom classes as private events, in every single Zoom session that we do, all of the participants know each other and therefore are not afraid to ask questions. And it becomes a more intimate experience, which is more enjoyable for everyone involved. So If you guys had fun and have more questions or would love to do something like this for a birthday or upcoming special event, Father's Day is right around the corner, feel free to get in touch and we'd be happy to coordinate some sort of private Zoom class for you guys.
Thank you again so much. And for all those who came today, thank you for tuning in. And Eric has been so lovely in hosting William and Mary events at his wine store in the past. And I'm hopeful that once this crisis is over, we'll eventually be able to go back and do another one in person, because it really is such a special store. And we just have a wonderful time every time we're with you. I just have a few concluding things and just want to again thank everybody for attending this evening. And during this time, it's more important now more than ever to stay connected as a William and Mary community. Though we're not able to gather in person, we recognize how powerful it can be for us to virtually come together to support and learn from one another. The William and Mary Alumni Association offers many ways to stay involved online, and then there is a full list available, as I mentioned, on our virtual engagement opportunities webpage at wmalumni.com. So there's certainly room for and time, I'm sure, for another wine tasting with you, Eric. So let's think about maybe doing another one.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric.